is VT. VT is Victoria Terminus. This is um, I'll tell you a little. I'll tell you something here. I want you to think about it later on. Okay. So the amazing thing is that this is an example of English Gothic architecture of the 19th century. And I think you may know that this is a World Heritage Site. This
Hmm.
building. This is a World Heritage UNESCO site because this is one of the most glorious examples of English Gothic architecture anywhere in the world.
Oh, really?
Yes, there are very few examples of this kind, even in England, of this magnitude. And the story I want to tell you very simply is this, although that's not the main point of introducing this slide. Um, I'll get to that in a moment, which is that I saw Victoria Terminus, or VT, which is what it was called when I first saw it, Victoria Terminus, before I saw London. I saw London after I saw this. And then when I went to London, the first thing I said to everyone was, my God, London is a copy of Bombay. All right. So you see, this is what you do when you do postmodern things. That what is the original, what is a copy? Of course, there is English Gothic architecture in England itself, and there's some superb examples of that. But it's as if England introduced in India an England which was even better than the England back home. All right, you think about it, right? And there is, by the way, another big complex in Mumbai, which is also enormous, and that also has a very British name, of course, Churchgate, right? Which is another major terminus. Now, VT is not the official name of this terminus. The official name was changed about 25 years ago. It's called Chhatrapti Shivaji Terminal. Okay, Chhatrapati Shivaji Terminal. Chhatrapati is Lord, okay, of the universe, roughly, the great king, crowned emperor, right? And then Shivaji, that's the name, right? So Chhatrapati is simply actually, the title that you give. All right. So it was renamed by the Shiv Sena government about 25 years ago. Now, what we're really looking at here is we're looking at one, number one, a major figure called Shivaji. Number two, we are looking at the group of people that he's associated with, the community that he's associated with, which is going to have a significant part in the history of India for close to 200 years. And in some ways, that history is being played out every day in India today, because Shivaji is, you might say, one of the great iconic figures of Hindu nationalism now. The nationalist government, both at the central level and the Shiv Sena, which is a Hindu nationalist government, but this is a long story. What are their difference with BJP? Why they're at odds with each other all the time? That's a long story. We won't get into it at the moment. For all of them, Shivaji is one of the most iconic figures. Okay, so therefore, the politics of the interpretation of Shivaji is a major thing that we have to really think about. All right. And then, of course, the history of Shivaji and the Marathas intersects with the history of um, Aurangzeb and the Mughal Empire. And then, if you look at the later history of the Marathas, that intersects with the history of the British. Um, the Marathas, in this sense, continue to be a force until 1818, when they are finally defeated by the British, okay, in a major engagement, which is in 1818, and that's the end of what you might call Maratha rule. Now, when did it all start? It starts in 1627 um, with the birth of the figure of Shivaji. The Marathas had already been part of the arm of the Mughal armies, though. Okay, so the Marathas are a group of people based in modern day Maharashtra, and you know they had some of them had gained employment in the armies in that region. So that would include the Bahmani sultanates, right? So that is why I had showed you this slide over here, because these are the Bahmani sultanates here, and places like Bijapur and so on are going to be very important centers for the Marathas. The Marathas are going to put together a string of forts all across this part of Western India. And if you look at this um, slide over here, sorry, not this one here. I think I have to show you a slide that's further down the road. You will see that. So if you look at this over right here, so I think this, by the way, map is frankly very misleading, because it tells you the Maratha kingdom 1664 to 1760. It's very misleading. Um, this is a map brought out by a major company in India, because it suggests that this entire region here in pink purple was under the Marathas from this period of time 1664 to 1760. That is absolutely incorrect. What they mean to say, what they mean to imply in this map is that some portion or the other that is now shown here in pink or purple was at some point between 1664 and 1760, okay, under the Marathas. So for example, in the 1760s, the Marathas are going to come into Delhi, they're going to raid it, all right, but they never hold on to it. It's never part of the Maratha Empire. So which is why I'm saying this map is incorrect. But they did actually take possession, as it were, conquer, and then just leave, right? And that's true of many other parts. But the Maratha influence in terms of where exactly they ruled extended over a much shorter. So if you look over here, this is a much more accurate representation of the extent of the territories that were initially under Shivaji, this portion here that you see over here. So, more along the coast, okay, and more particularly
The
at
west,
the
all along the west coast of.
all along the west coast, yes, all along the west coast. But this is a portion really under Maratha rule over here. If you look at the key there, right, under Maratha rule. But their influence extended all along the west here too, sometimes into the interior. And then over the course of the next several decades, they will get portions of here. Sometimes they'll come into eastern India, raid into eastern India, raid into North India. When I was growing up, my mother used to tell me, and she was absolutely right about it, because I heard this from so many other people, that they used to always uh, tell little children who gave trouble sleeping, you better sleep, and sleep tight, because if you don't, you are going to be tormented by the war cries of the Marathas. That is, the Marathas had this reputation for being looters and being rapacious invaders. And the idea of the Marathas was supposed to frighten people, especially little children. Uh, I'm not saying that this is how the Marathas were. I'm saying this is the kind of stories that were often told. All right.
And sorry, I missed it just before. Vinay, how big was their empire, sort of?
So you see, now look at this map here. This map indicates this is, so here now we're talking about Maratha territories here. So initially under Shivaji, it's this area where my cursor is. Some influence going down to the west coast, some, okay. Sometimes they've raided, into eastern India, into north in the 1760s, right? It's scattered here and there. But if you're really looking at the heart of Maratha territory, you're really talking about this over here. Okay, you're talking about sort of Western India, present day Maharashtra, portions going into MP, into Madhya Pradesh, all right, into Gwalior. I mean, at least 5, 6 hours away from Delhi. That's what you're really talking about. All right. So they are a considerable presence, but they're obviously not equivalent to anything remotely like what the Mughals had created as an empire. All right. So now,
But that's very large, isn't it? Isn't it, Vinay?
sorry.
I mean, it's obviously not as big as the Mughals that went to,
Not at
you know,
all. No, no, not at all.
Iraq.
That's what I'm
And,
saying. They're not remotely as, not even remotely as large as the Mughal Empire. Mughal Empire was much larger, much larger. And the Mughals extended, remember, west of Delhi into the Punjab, into modern day Afghanistan, right? Just think about the extent of, look at this map here once again, and you'll see what I'm talking about. The Mughal Empire, see, this is all Mughal domains, everything here in orange and yellow by the time of Aurangzeb,
mm,
right? By 1700. um, the Maratha influence was substantially smaller, but when you see a map like the one that I just showed you, and that's what I said, that this is actually a very misleading map. It's a way, you see it, the fact that a map like this is being produced by a company called Maps of India, which is a very big company, right, shows you the extent to which they are trying to manipulate the historical evidence. Because what really happens simply is that the Marathas are going to launch these attacks, and they're going to be able to come into Delhi, but they're not ruling over Delhi. That's what you have to remember. They're not ruling over Delhi really. They're not ruling over many of these places where they're. But this map seems to suggest that the Maratha kingdom, extended from 1664 to 1760. That is for over 1 century through all of this part of India. That is incorrect. All right. Now let's get to the heart of the matter here. So Shivaji is born in 1627, and he is the son of a man called Shahji. Okay, Bhonsle. Um, his father is a jagirdar. Jagir was, remember, a what you might call a gift of land that was conferred uh, by the Mughal emperor and by the sultans. The sultans are of the sultanates, right, in South India, the Bahmani sultanates that we've talked about, Bijapur and Golconda, all of that. So he's actually a jagirdar of the Sultan of Ahmadnagar in Pune, but his father had shifted his allegiance to the Sultan of Bijapur later on, right? So Shivaji's father, if you had to simplify it really, he's a higher level official bureaucrat. He's a bureaucrat who moves from one court to another. All right, not working for the Mughals directly, working for the Sultan of Ahmadnagar, and then working for the Sultan of Bijapur later on. Um, Now, when Shah Jahan leads his forces, the Mughal emperor leads his forces into the Deccan. At that point, Shahaji, that is Shivaji's father, he decides to accept the offer of a mansabdari from the Mughal emperor. So he becomes a mansabdar of the Mughal emperor. But when Shah Jahan actually retreats from the Deccan, then at that point he goes back to the Sultan of Ahmednagar. What we're really talking about is a bureaucrat who basically moves from one court to another, who's not loyal to any of the rulers, and is essentially, really, this is the best way to put it, is really someone who's an opportunist. He's basically trying to make the best opportunity he can, and he doesn't really have any loyalties. At a time when loyalty was important, at a time when loyalty was important. Um, uh, this also meant that he's kind of shuffles around. And of course, you could say, and this is certainly what the Maratha interpretation would be. The Maratha interpretation was, it's not that he wasn't loyal, it's that he wanted his political independence. Shivaji's father, but somehow was never able to find it. That And the best way of getting this political independence was never to be too loyal to any one ruler. All right. Now, he is going to um, be succeeded by his son. When I say succeeded, that when Shivaji grows up into his teens, he's basically going to, take over the political responsibilities that his uh, father has. Uh, the city that is important in the first instance, I want to spend a couple of minutes on this city, is the city of Pune, or called Pune during the British period, but it's the same city. The Pune is the older name, and now it's the name once again that is really used. The city is important because going back to the time of Shivaji, that's when the city is going to start acquiring a reputation which is going to build up during the nationalist period as a city of what you might describe as Hindu militancy and Hindu orthodoxy. There were 5 or 6 assassination attempts on Mahatma Gandhi. Okay. The last one, of course, succeeded, the one where he was killed by Nathuram Godse. Um, and which city did Godse come from? Which city did all the previous assassins who had tried to kill Gandhi come from? They all came from Pune, the same place that is important in the life of Shivaji and the Marathas. Pune is also going to develop into a city of Orthodox Sanskrit learning. So, very often when Europeans scholars want to learn Sanskrit and they want to find a Pandit who will teach them, even today, one of the places they go to is Banaras, the other place they go to is Pune. All right. So Pune has long been known as a center for kind of Sanskritic learning. So you can see, right, the kind of a place that is important in the Brahminical worldview, Sanskrit learning, orthodoxy, a certain tradition of militancy will develop. And in some respects, some of this goes back to Shivaji, not all of it, because Shivaji certainly was not a Brahmin. We'll get to that in just a few moments. Now, Shivaji is going to be most well known for what? He's going to be most well known in Hindu nationalist histories as someone who is going to create a Hindu kingdom of resistance specifically to counter the Mughal threat. That's how he's going to be viewed by Hindu nationalist historians. Let me put it in simpler. He is going to be viewed as, in some ways, as the founding father of Hindu nationalism, actually, in some ways. Okay? In Hindu nationalist histories later on. Right? From the point of view of a professional historian, one of the things that Shivaji is really known for is for, in some ways, along with someone like Malik Ambar, I don't know if you remember that Habshi, that Ethiopian person we had seen during the reign of Jahangir, right? He's going to be seen as one of the pioneers of guerrilla warfare. And then to understand how this guerrilla warfare works, just take your mind back to what I mentioned to you earlier. You're talking about these massive Mughal armies that would be moving along, would be setting up camp. I mean, it would take them months to get to their destination. And we're talking about, sometimes 200, 300, 400,000 soldiers. And accompanying that, there would be, thousands of civilians, people who are cooks, people who are, um, sweepers, because, when you set up a camp, then you have to sweep everything, right? People, even women who were basically nautch girls and dancers and sometimes prostitutes. I mean, they're all part of the army, right? I mean, and people who are carrying, goods, carrying the tents, etc., etc. All right. And what happens when you have an army of this size is that there are people who get left off, people who get separated, people who are slower on their feet, people who are injured. Part of this guerrilla warfare worked because what these Marathas did was they would conduct these lightning raids. They would pick on people who very often, as I said, get left behind. But even otherwise, The thing is that the Mughal army is this massive, it's a monstrosity. It's a huge, it's like a, if you had to sort of take the analogy of an animal, it's an elephant, right? It moves slowly, it's cumbersome. It may be very intelligent, but it's slow. And the Marathas are basically like, they won't like this comparison, they won't like the analogy, they're like mice. They're creeping underneath your skin, as it were. They quickly get in, they're darting in and out. The minute they see some threat, they dart into a hole, right? So that's what these Marathas are, basically trained warriors who conduct these lightning attacks, pick up strong people who have been left behind, right? And it's very hard for the Mughal army to essentially be able to counter them. That's one of the things they're going to find out. And this terrain that they're fighting in, for example, modern day Aurangabad, where the Ajanta, as I said, the starting off point for the Ajanta Ellora caves. I mean, the Western Ghats. So portion of it, the Western Ghats, is obviously mountainous, jungle. But then if you get into the interior, into the Deccan, into the interior of the Deccan, you're talking about terrain over there that has these caves and terrain that really, if a person knows that terrain, they can make advantage of it. All right. So his importance is, as I suggested, partly because of this, but this is not primarily how he's remembered by Hindu nationalist historians. He's remembered as not simply the father of the Maratha nation. Some claim him, as I say, as the first Indian nationalist. Most others claim him, particularly the nationalist Hindu historians, as the first Hindu nationalist and someone who had envisioned the idea of a Hindu nation. Okay. Now, before we get further into his life, take, for example, this book here. This is a book called The Maratha Movement, Hindu Padshahi, or a Review of the Hindu Empire of Maharashtra, written by a man called Vinayak Damodar Savarkar. All right. I have written on Savarkar. His name is inescapable in modern day India because the present day Hindu nationalist government reveres him. Okay, he reveres him. He has a very different reputation, and probably a very, very bad reputation in other intellectual circles, where he's seen as someone who actually, even though who claimed to defend the Hindus, was really a coward. And more importantly, someone who was in many ways implicated in the assassination of Gandhi on 30th January 1948. Nathuram Godse was definitely a follower of Vinayak Savarkar. There's just no question about it. He considered himself a devotee of Savarkar, right? But that's a long history. Here, it's interesting that as early as 1920s, he writes a book called The Maratha Movement. And before that, by the way, he had already written a number of other works, including a work where he writes about the 1857-58 rebellion as the first Indian War of Independence. All right. Now, the preface to the second edition of this book in 1942, I have this quotation which I'm going to read out to you. This preface is written by Manohar Kelkar. He says, quote, "It was to realize this great ideal of the Hindu Padshahi, okay, that is a Hindu empire, and to liberate Hindudom from the shackles of Muslim domination, that the Marathas waged a relentless war, roughly speaking, from 1600 to 1800. The struggle went on till the Hindu arms were crowned with an unchallengeable triumph. Hindu supremacy and rule extended once more from the Punjab to Tanjore, and not a vestige was left of the Muslim Empire throughout Hindustan." All right, so let's just pause very briefly, and we'll do that with the next few quotations. because the claim of this is not the author, this is the person who's writing, not Savarkar, this is the person who's writing a preface, to this, suggesting why this book is so important, saying that, look, this Shivaji uh, tried to create this Hindu empire. The idea was to liberate Hindus from the domination of the Muslims, and the Marathas, who Shivaji led, waged this relentless war for 200 years. Hindu arms were crowned with an unchallengeable triumph, and Hindu supremacy and rule extended once more from the Punjab to Tanjore, that is, from north to the south, which is, as we've seen through the maps, technically not correct. Okay, right? I want you to just think about it, and you'll see the elaboration. Think about the use of the word Hindu here all the time. Okay, now he continues in this preface. In fulfilling this mission, the Marathas came occasionally into inevitable conflict with their co-religionists, like the Rajputs and the Jats. So here he's contending with the fact that the Marathas, yes, he's already described the Marathas as those who helped to put the Muslims in their place, but he's saying that the Marathas did fight with other non-Muslim Hindus, such as the Rajputs and the Jats, right? This aspect of the Maratha history continued to be the most misunderstood part in all other provinces in India, and our non-Maratha Hindu brethren, misled by the English historians in particular, keep laboring under a wrong notion that after Shivaji's death, the Maratha movement lost its ideal value altogether and got degenerated into a mass movement of freebooters. So the preface he's saying, in this preface he's saying that, look, in other parts of India, people have been misled. Our Hindu brothers and sisters in other parts of India have been misled by English historians, especially, into thinking that with the death of Shivaji, the Marathas disappear. And he's saying, no, not at all. And nor is it accurate to say that there was simply a mass movement of freebooters, that is, looters and people who are basically taking advantage, right? The author of this book, in its second part, corrects this misunderstanding and misinterpretation and reveals the dignity of the motive which inspired the Maratha movement and the dazzling glory of its triumphant achievements in defense of Hindudom. So notice once again, the argument is that these Marathas were self-consciously acting to create a Hindu empire, right? And this is precisely what we will have to question. Now, what does Shiv Savarkar himself say in the book? Because so far we've seen the preface written by someone else. What he says can be condensed in the following observations. First, that the history of the Marathas extends well beyond Shivaji. I entirely agree with that. I don't think anyone would have a serious disagreement with that. Okay. His argument, secondly, is that Marathas have to be understood from a Hindu viewpoint, that most of what has been written, remember this book is written in the 1920s, that most of what has been written about the Marathas has been written really by English historians or by other Europeans and sometimes by Muslim historians. But he says, I'm going to attempt to understand it, the figure of Shivaji and the history of the Marathas from this Hindu standpoint. All right. Our chief aim in writing this critical work, which is primarily addressed to the public outside Maharashtra, has been to ascertain and appraise the value of the Maratha movement in terms of Hindu history. Right. So we want to look at him and the history of the Marathas in terms of the history of the Hindus. Right. Then he says this is a period when Hindu history, when the Hindus were engaged in a struggle of life and death with the Mohammedan power. So he's saying, if you look at the history of the Marathas, it was a struggle to the finish. Our foe were the Muslims. Now, remember, the English have come into India, but this certainly is the case that at this point in time when Shivaji is around, the English are not a factor. not at all a factor. They're going to be a factor for the Marathas in the 1700s and the 18 and early 1800s, right? But certainly in the 1600s, the English are not a factor from the point of view of the Marathas or from the point of view of anyone. All right. Now, Savarkar continues, our Mohammedan countrymen, that is, our Muslim brethren, should try to read this history without attributing any ill feeling to us towards our Mohammedan countrymen, okay, of this generation or towards the community as such. And think about what he's saying, because what he's saying is that, look, I'm going to say some things about the Marathas and about how they fought the Muslims. And it was a fight to the finish. Either the Muslims would survive or we would survive. And he says, I want the present day Muslims to know that I have no animosity about you, but I'm going to have to say some ugly things about your community because I am, after all, writing the history of the Marathas, and this is what they thought. So he's trying to suggest that, look, this poison of thinking about the Hindus and Muslims as constantly in conflict, this is not a poison that has entered into me, right? At least that's his claim. It's not entered into me. I hold nothing against you. I don't want you to misinterpret what I'm saying, but I'm presenting the history. And the history was that the Marathas saw this as a struggle of life and death with the Muslims, right? And then his further rationale is that, look, people talk about Hindu-Muslim unity, but there can never be any unity between master and slave. And unfortunately, at that time, Hindus, he's implying, were treated as slaves. The Muslims were the masters, and there can be no unity between the two, right? This was a fierce struggle. It was a fierce test that the Hindus were called upon to pass in their deadly struggle with the Mohammedan powers. Notice how often he uses these phrases: deadly struggle with the Mohammedan power, struggle of life and death with the Mohammedan power, colossal struggle, right? It's constantly going to be there in this history, every page after page. And he says that sometimes we have to be aware that this is how the struggle is, and only when we have recognized it can we speak about the possibility of unity. All right. So, one further set of considerations from this book, and then we quickly go back to the history of Shivaji, all right, and the Marathas, and what are some of the episodes from his life, right? So he says of Shivaji, but to the Hindu people as a whole, not only in Maharashtra, but throughout the Deccan and even in the north, he was the one great champion of their cause. And of course, I would say, because he's now talking about Shivaji, and remember that Shivaji is born in 1627, so he starts to become important around, let's just take a rough date, 1650, and he's going to die in 1680, so it's not a very long life. But more importantly, he's suggesting that throughout India, throughout the Deccan and even in the north, he was a one great champion of their cause. Notice all the claims he's making, right? The chosen hero of his race who was destined to win the political independence of his land and race. There are 3 or 4 different claims in this sentence here. One claim is that Shivaji's name was recognized in his own lifetime and in the subsequent years by Hindus all over the country. Number 2, which he doesn't even pause to question Savarkar, he just assumes, you can take for granted, that the Vaishnavas, the Shaivites, the Shaktos, the Kabir Panthis, the Nanak Panthis, the Tantrics, they were all thinking of themselves as Hindus. And recall what I had mentioned to you here when we were looking, for example, at Pandit Sundar Lal, who's saying that the way the British were able to actually conquer India is precisely because Indians had no notion of Indianness, no notion of nationality. And Savarkar might say, hey, there's no contradiction because I'm not speaking about Indianness. I'm speaking about the fact that Hindus all over the country thought of themselves as Hindus. Right? Notice that he uses the word Hindu here. He's not using the word Indian. And I'm suggesting to you, well, actually, this doesn't resolve the issue because there's almost no evidence to really suggest that people throughout the country, going all the way up to North India, were thinking of themselves as Hindus, right? But he's also saying, Savarkar, that if we had to write the history of Indian nationalism and Hindu nationalism, for which for him are this one and the same thing, we can write it back to the 17th century now. Because typically, what do historians do? Indian nationalism, history of that goes back to the 19th century. Right? Now, he pushes this history back to the 17th century. And again, that's why I give a number of quotations. So he says the cause that was being fought out by the Marathas aimed at nothing short of the deliverance of the Hindu people and the Hindu land from the hated alien bondage. That the reason why the Marathas were fighting the Mughals is because they thought of the Mughals as a Muslim power, and the Marathas thought of themselves as a Hindu power, and their sole objective was to drive these Muslims out of India, right? Drive them out of India. The generations after Shivaji were animated by the same noble spirit of patriotism, the consciousness of continuing the sacred mission of winning back the political independence of the Hindu race, right? Hindu race. See, where is Savarkar getting these ideas, such as this phrasing called the Hindu race? And I'm going to suggest to you that in many ways he was very much influenced by late 19th century European thought. All right. So he is basically what we would call a social Darwinist. So social Darwinism is a what you might describe as a political and philosophical movement, which becomes very important in England and then America in the 19th century, late 19th century especially. And fundamentally, the idea is that, look, if you're really looking at human societies, you're really looking at a jungle out there. Okay, it's the survival of the fittest. So you take the Darwinian idea, you put it into the social realm. All right. I mean, I'm simplifying, obviously, but that's what it is. That it's essentially a kind of a jungle. Might makes right. All right. And we can actually think of the world as composed of distinct races. And we can then create a hierarchy of these races. Right? So the consciousness, the generations after Shivaji, that is, the later Marathas, were animated by the same noble spirit of patriotism, the consciousness of continuing the same sacred mission of winning back the political independence of the Hindu race and defending the Hindu dharma from the attacks of an alien and barbarous foe. Right? Here, freebooters and plunderers could not have obtained success in such a war against such a foe. So, one of the things that Savarkar had to fight was this long standing view, which many Hindus themselves had, that the Marathas were really a group of people who were really plunderers. They looted, they raided, they pillaged, right? Which is obviously not a very favorable, view of a group of people. And so what Savarkar is trying to do is he's also trying to say that no, that's not the case. Okay, they couldn't have become such great warriors if they were simply looters and all of that. All right. Now, when we go back to this slide over here, so what Shivaji is going to do is that he is going to create a kind of a mobile fighting force, which is going to be, his army, and they are going to start to enter into this guerrilla warfare, not only against the Mughal emperor. Remember that it is really only in the last 20 years of Aurangzeb's rule that the Deccan is going to start to come under the control of the Mughal Empire, because you remember that we have constantly spoken about the struggle of being able to contain South India, absorb it within the empire, and then eventually it's really only in the late 1680s, 1690s that Aurangzeb is able to bring the Deccan into his control, right? And then what you have in the meantime, in the 1660s and before, 1670s, you have these sultanates that I've spoken to you about before: Ahmadnagar, Bijapur, Golconda, right? And Shivaji's father, as I've already pointed out, moved from one of these to another. Now, to understand um, uh, what kind of personality he had, we look at one major episode um, from his life. Okay, one major episode from his life, and this concerns the killing of a man called Afzal Khan. So if you see here, 1659, Shivaji kills uh, Afzal Khan. All right, let me just explain really what I'm really talking about. Okay, so Shivaji's main interest at this point in time uh, was to subdue Bijapur. So um, I'm talking about 1656 here. 1656, that means that he's born in 1627. So he's 29 years old at this point in time. All right. He's 29 years old. Um, the Sultan of Bijapur, uh, one of these sultanates, Muhammad Adil Shah, had died in November of 1656. His successor, a man called Ali Adil Shah, sent his general Afzal Khan, right? So that's a person that we're interested in, at the head of an army of 10,000 troops to surround and subdue Shivaji and his fortress at Pratapgarh. So I, I pointed out to you very briefly that Shivaji and the Marathas are going to set up these fortresses. Okay, so these, they try to make them as impenetrable as possible. Usually on top of a hill, and then obviously from there you can command the landscape around you. But obviously they're not completely impregnable, because historically speaking, there've always been forts and fortifications, and then it's still possible to take them over, to scale them, right? If you send a large enough army, and particularly if you have the use of artillery and all of that, right? Now, um, what's going to happen is that, so without getting into all the details, that um, uh, Afzal Khan uh, is going to be able to get word from Shivaji. Shivaji sends word to Afzal Khan that, look, I'm willing to surrender to you. Okay, I'm willing to surrender to you. And so Afzal Khan agrees to meet him in person to accept his surrender. Now, the narrative that has been given by historians is that Afzal Khan had decided already to commit treachery, that when he meets Shivaji in person, his intent was to actually kill him on the spot. But these same historians tell us that Shivaji knew, anticipated that Afzal Khan was going to do that. All right. So, in other words, what Shivaji is going to do is that he's going to give a fatal dose of Afzal Khan's own medicine back to him. Right. And so, if you look at this here, all right, so this is a representation, a wonderful representation right over here. So, this is um, a painting. Um, so, this was actually a nationalist print published in 1920 by the Chitrashala Press in Pune. Um, and what it shows here is, so the two men meet. This is Shivaji here, and this is Aurangzeb. Sorry, Afzal Khan. Excuse me. This is Afzal Khan. And you notice, by the way, that there's blood dripping down here, right? There's blood dripping down here, and you can notice that what Shivaji has, if you look at his hands here, you see a kind of what you might call a little tiger's claw, a tiger's claw. All right. So when the two of them meet, according to the legend that has been put forward, Shivaji prevents Afzal Khan from committing this act of treachery where he intended to kill him when they were going to hug each other. That before Afzal Khan can do anything, he himself disembowels him. That is that he's got these a tiger's claw which he's worn on top of his hands, and then he sinks that deep into his heart. You can see that right there, right? So this is intended to convey the heroism and the savviness of Shivaji. But of course, the Hindu nationalist historians also interpret it as meaning not simply conveying what I mentioned to you, the savviness and bravery of Shivaji, but the fact that, hey, you can't really trust a Muslim, right? And Shivaji knew that. Shivaji knew that, and that's why he decided that before he gets attacked personally, he's going to actually put him to death. All right. Um, if you read the Bengali historian Jadunath Sarkar, whom I had mentioned before in the last session, because of this long history that he wrote, I think it's a 4-volume work, History of Aurangzeb. He describes the whole scene there, right? He describes the whole scene, um, and it's rather interesting and disturbing that something like this is uh, described in euphoric terms by Maratha historians in recent decades as something which lends great glory to Shivaji and so forth. So, for example, a volume that came out on the 300th anniversary of the coronation of Shivaji, to which I'll turn after this, this is described as the most glorious event in the history of the Marathas, right? The most glorious history event in the history of the Marathas. Now, here are a couple more interesting considerations. Um, it is sufficient to know only this much for our purposes at this point. So once again, I go back here to this slide over here. That Shivaji is going to continue to be an obstacle, okay, for the Mughals. It's going to be continue to be an obstacle for the Mughals. He's going to raid Surat. Surat was a major uh, Mughal stronghold, right? And he's going to raid it 3 times over the course of 15-20 years. In 1665, he's going to sue for peace because, by this time, the Mughals have themselves gotten involved. Aurangzeb is going to eventually, of course, ascend to the throne. And Shivaji is going to realize that he's really, frankly, not a match for the Mughals at this point in time. So he signs a treaty. He's actually going to be confined. It's a long history where I don't get into all the details because he agrees to the terms, and he's going to be made even a mansabdar at the Mughal court. Then eventually he's going to be confined to a prison for secession. And there is this glorious story that is told about how he escapes from Aurangzeb's prison, then is going to, reassemble the warriors that he had, and he's going to recapture some of the territories. The most interesting episode is what happens in 1674. All right. Now, before I explain the significance of that, so what happens in 1674 is that he is going to have a coronation. That is, that he is going to have an assembly, a massive assembly, where he's going to get himself crowned an emperor. Okay. Right. So this is the coronation. So that's what I mean by crown Chhatrapti Shivaji. Chhatrapati Shivaji. All right. So Lord of the universe. All right. And this is in a place called Raigad. That's where the ceremony is going to take place. So here's the interesting problem. The problem is that what background did he actually come from? Now, to understand the complexity here. Maharashtra in the 17th century and for some centuries before that had a somewhat different social order than some other parts of India. Okay? Because essentially in Maharashtra, you had the Brahmins, right? So, for example, Pune was a city of Brahmin orthodoxy. And then you had what were called the Shudras. Now, what I'm saying here is very, very surprising to most people who are not aware of the social history of Western India at this point in time, because typically we think of India when we think of the caste system, when we think of the different castes, and we say you have the Brahmins, and you have the Kshatriyas, the warriors, and you have the Vaishyas, the merchant castes, and all of that, and then you have the Shudras. In Maharashtra, you did not really have the middle castes, which therefore meant, or rather, the more accurate way of putting it is that in Maharashtra, they only recognized really the Brahmins and then the non-Brahmins who were simply called the Shudras. Okay? Because the word Shudra can indicate a very low caste. And there's no evidence to suggest that Shivaji was from a very, very low caste, but he was certainly not a Brahmin. And he was not what you would call a Kshatriya, because that word was, the word Shudra definitely did not include a person who was a Kshatriya. Now remember that in India, at least according to the traditional norms of Hindu kingship, because he is a Hindu, right? He's a Hindu. And here I'm using the word provisionally because the question is whether he thinks of himself as a Hindu, but I'm just saying that we can use that shorthand because he certainly saw himself as someone who would have identified with what you would describe as followers of Shiva or Vishnu, whatever the case may be. Okay, so to that extent, he he is someone who recognizes the authority of the Vedas and the authority of the Brahminical tradition. That is, I think, the more important consideration when you think of Shivaji as someone who is a Hindu, right? Okay, or might be thinking of himself in some ways, right, without actually, designating himself as a Hindu, right? Now, in Hindu kingship, it is the Kshatriyas who rule. But Shivaji is not a Kshatriya. He's not a Kshatriya. He's, in fact, what you would call a Shudra. Okay, and so if you look at this slide over here, this is taken from the internet, where, and you'll find many such sites where the person who's created this site, it's completely immaterial who's created the website, because as I said, there are really dozens of them of this kind. It says Shivaji Maharaj, the greatest Shudra mountain warrior. Okay, and then when you start reading the articles, he talks about how treacherous the Brahmins are. So this is definitely being written by someone who's a Dalit or a Shudra, who's trying to suggest that, look, we had great Dalit or Shudra leaders back then, and Shivaji was actually a Shudra. Now, of course, if you went around in Maharashtra calling Shivaji a Shudra, you'd get into serious trouble. You get into serious trouble because the Shudra is a lower caste person. All right. So, what does Shivaji do? In order to have himself appointed, okay, a great king, a, right, a Maharaj, a great emperor, he has to have the Brahmins certify that he is actually legible to rule. So, what he is going to do is he is going to invite a Brahmin. Okay, he's a Brahmin from Banaras, and you know that Banaras was one of the major centers of what you might call Brahmin orthodoxy. He's going to invite a Brahmin whose name is Gaga Bhatt, who does, if I may be a little ironical and a little cheeky here, he's going to do the very Brahminical thing. And the Brahminical thing is he's going to say, sure, I'll rewrite your genealogy. Because what Shivaji tells this man is that you need to rewrite my genealogy. You need to write a genealogy which shows that I'm actually a Kshatriya descended from the solar dynasty of Mewar. which is a great Rajput dynasty, you know, right? And so and when a Brahmin says that on the authority of a Brahmin, it can get accepted. And so 11,000 Brahmins, along with Gaga Bhatt, are going to be invited. They're going to chant the Vedas, and they're basically going to have this investiture ceremony where he is now going to be crowned the king, and the world is going to be persuaded that, hey, Shivaji has always been an upper caste person. He is a Kshatriya, right? He comes from a royal line of descent and all of that, right? This is the way in which he is going to try to pass himself off as a great Kshatriya warrior who belongs to this, noble line. He has an ancestry that goes back for centuries, and therefore he is someone who can be viewed as a legitimate ruler. All right. So this is in many ways the most striking episode from his life. But what is the real significance? Because this is what I really want to end with. Before I get to that, just keep in mind what Savarkar has said. The point that I do agree with, one of the few things I agree with what he has said, namely that the history of the Marathas does not end with Shivaji by any stretch of the imagination. The Marathas are going to continue to be important after Shivaji dies in 1680. um, they are never going to be able to disavow their reputation as people who basically conduct guerrilla warfare, who are going to conduct raids and so on. But this is also, to a substantial degree, a mistaken view, because the Marathas did have enormous administrative abilities. And what you're going to find actually shortly after the death of Shivaji, well, he's going to be succeeded by his oldest son, and then by his second son. And then what's going to happen is that the Marathas, who by the 1700s are going to control a substantial portion of central India, right? The Deccan and central India, they are going to actually divide into what you might call 5 different branches, and it's called the Maratha Confederacy, right? So we're not really looking at that at this point in time, because that's a later history. And the Maratha Confederacy is this, what you might call this group of Maratha chieftains who are going to rule over their specific kingdoms, and they're going to have close networks amongst themselves, right? So the Marathas are going to continue to be a major force in some respects, um, and are even going to be able to actually, give battle to the Mughal emperor at the heart of his capital in Delhi. When we're looking at the mid 1700s, but they never are able to maintain what you might describe as a very large Hindu empire over a period of time. And then in 1818 they are going to be defeated by the East India Company, and that's going to really be the end of the Marathas. The significance of Shivaji in particular is that the Indian nationalists were always, the Hindu nationalists in particular, okay, um, were always looking back to the 17th century and even earlier to see whether they could find figures who they could recover as great examples of Hindu resistance to Muslim rule, and then subsequently English rule, but Muslim resistance to Muslim rule in particular. So the question here is whether, in fact, it is accurate to describe Shivaji as a great, um, creator of the idea of a Hindu nation, um, to depict him as someone who deliberately sought to elevate the Hindus and to defeat the Muslims. Because, look at it this way. If you look at his army, you find, for example, a large number of Muslims who served in his army. You find that he is constantly seeking alliance with Muslim rulers. You have to ask yourself whether he's really thinking of himself as a Hindu at all, or whether he's simply positioning himself like everyone else did in the 17th century as a person who is creating or trying to create an empire and therefore is going to take battle with whoever he needs to take battle with in order to be able to expand his own territories. Right? So, what was his relationship to Bijapur, to Ahmadnagar? Right? Now, if you look at Bijapur and Ahmadnagar, these two Deccani sultanates, both of these are Shia sultanates. The Mughal emperor himself is a Sunni. Right? And we find that the Mughal emperor is constantly fighting these Shia rulers. So this is one Muslim ruler against another ruler. Right? Much in the same way in which the Mughal emperor is going to fight the Marathas. And this is the question that constantly comes up. Are we actually planting these religious categories back into the 17th century and saying all of these people were thinking of themselves in preeminently religious terms? And my submission to you is this is actually inaccurate. They are not necessarily thinking of themselves in preeminently religious terms. Yes, Shivaji sees that the Mughals are there and they have infiltrated the territory, or that, hey, the Bijapur Sultanate is there. But for him, these are foes that he must deal with, just as you would deal with a foe who happened to be European, if indeed it had been the Europeans who were contesting him. And the fact that the Marathas are going to enter into conflict with the Europeans later on suggests exactly what I'm trying to point out, namely that this idea of a Hindu Muslim animosity that guided Shivaji, this idea is a late 19th century idea of Hindu nationalists. Okay, late 19th and then 20th century. This is not fundamentally how we should be looking at the figure of Shivaji. So there is a politics to the interpretation of Shivaji. Um, and just so that you get a sense of it, let me give you a couple of quotations, and I'm going to conclude with that for today. So, for example, you have Lala Lajpat Rai, who is a major Indian nationalist in the late 19th century, early 20th century. He's nicknamed Lion of the Punjab. He publishes a biography of Shivaji in Urdu in 1896, and he commends Shivaji to the attention of the youth, telling the young men of and women of India why they should look to the figure of Shivaji, because he says Shivaji, quote, protected his own religion, saved the cow and the Brahmin, but he did not disrespect any other religion. Right? So his view is a little bit more nuanced, that Shivaji is very much acting as a Hindu ruler, but he did not disrespect the Muslims. This is the highest praise that can be bestowed on a Hindu hero like Shivaji in the days of Aurangzeb. All right. And of course, I have given to you um, the verdict of Jadunath Sarkar before, right? But notice that the same figure, Lala Lajpat Rai, whom I've just quoted, uh, also takes the view later on in the book that Shivaji's life demonstrated that during any time, there's a little error in his writing, during any time in Muslim rule, Hindus did not lose any opportunity to show their valor and attain freedom, nor did they quietly suffer oppression. So, one of the reasons why people like Lala Lajpat Rai are arguing this is because they are trying to combat this idea that the Hindus were a weak people, which is why they became vulnerable to the English. Um, and Lala Lajpat Rai is saying that, well, no, the history of Shivaji shows that we were always oppressing. I mean, we were always resisting um, the oppressor. So there's a major Hindu nationalist historian. His name is R C Majumdar. Um, I think if you were growing up in India in the 50s and 60s, you had to read R C Majumdar. Okay, it was almost compulsory. He was, I think, by far the most well known historian at that point in time. So he gives it as his opinion that in the whole history of India, there was no Hindu other than Shivaji who made such a pious resolve in his mind to save his country and religion, excuse me, from foreign yoke and oppression. Right? So once again, reinforcing this idea of Shivaji as the person who actually, in a sense, gave us the idea of Hindu national consciousness. Right? And that's why I've spent so much time on it, because this is a view that I'm suggesting to you would have to be actually contested. But even if we do contest it, as I am, it's significant that this is a view that has made sufficient inroads to be able to influence the course of modern India today, right? Which is shown by the fact that Shivaji has now become such a venerated, figure. All right. Any questions?
So you're saying it's not clear whether Shivaji was trying to be sort of a Hindu leader and was doing this very much um, in that vein versus just being a ruler trying to expand his rule.
In brief, yes. In brief, yes. Yeah. Then we always have to be careful about reading much later preoccupations back into the past, using the categories of a much later time. See, when someone like Lala Lajpat Rai is writing, right, 1890s, I just quoted him, when R C Majumdar is writing, he started writing much earlier. I mean, he only starts to get read seriously after the British leave, right? Because then the Indians can decide which history books are going to be circulated and so on. So in the 50s and 60s, R C Majumdar, Ramesh Chandra Majumdar became the most well-known historian, but he was writing in the 1920s and 30s already. See, these people have been deeply influenced by communalism, which we have talked about before, and particularly in the first set of lectures going back to um, April, May, that time. When I spoke to you about Gandhi, spoke to you about communalism, this idea that Hindu, Muslim have completely distinct identity. All Hindus will just gravitate towards Hindus, all Muslims will just automatically ally themselves with other Muslims. This idea that these are two blocks, two communities, they've always been at loggerheads, they've always been in conflict, right? That's communalism, where religion becomes a primordial element of your identity. Right? This idea of communalism is now being pushed back. You see, that's the problem. Because if Shivaji is so much a Hindu that he is driving out these foes because he sees them as Muslims, as intolerable fanatics, in other words, that's the implication that, hey, India or Hindustan gets taken over by these foreigners. And you yourself had asked the question that did these Mughal emperors, for example, did they move outside India? And you remember, and said, no, actually, look at Jahangir, look at Akbar, look at Shah Jahan, look at Aurangzeb. I mean, they are as Indian as anyone else at this point in time, right? And what was happening in the Mughal court? What was the nature of interactions, right? And then, just as I mentioned a few minutes ago, from the point of view of Aurangzeb, the Shias were Muslims, but the Shia rulers of Bijapur and Ahmadnagar are just as much a threat as anyone else. He doesn't spare them.
He doesn't spare who, sorry?
The rulers of Bijapur and Ahmadnagar, which are the Muslim sultanates. These are Muslim sultanates, remember, right? We've encountered them so many times, but they're not part of the Mughal Empire, right? Until they get subdued much later on. So the point here is that people are not simply looking in religious terms. They're not thinking about religious categories all the time. All right, let me give you a very simple illustration to explain how what happens when we transpose religious categories. So, I'm growing up in the 60s, 70s. I read a short little account in a newspaper, very short account, 10 lines, which you still find in the Indian newspaper. You'll find a very short little, and there'll be dozens of these little snippets. Okay. Man killed in a fight in such and such place in Bihar. And then you start reading, and it'll say a Hindu killed or was killed, depending on the story. A Hindu peasant was killed by a Muslim. Okay, or a Muslim peasant was killed by a Hindu. Right? Now, see what's happening there. This is a conflict over land. Conflicts over land in places like Bihar and UP are very, very common. And if you know the land structure and you know land holdings and who owns the land, for example, you find that many of the landlords are Hindus and the landless laborers are Muslims. So when there is a dispute, what's happening here in this little article? So there's a dispute and one person ends up killing another person. In this article, what's happened is that a class conflict has now been transformed into a religious conflict. See, there's going to be class conflict. You're a landless laborer. You feel that the landlord is oppressing you. The landlord is, for example, stripping you of, the grain that you have grown, not allowing you to even keep a portion of it. And so you kill the landlord. But you happen to be a Muslim, because that's what most landless laborers are. And most of the people who own the land are Hindus. And so what happens when the reporter writes about it? It's a Hindu killing a Muslim, or a Muslim killing a Hindu, depending on the nature of the conflict. When it is really a conflict between a lower class person and a upper class person, between the landless laborer and the zamindar. That's the conflict that we're really talking about. But it gets transposed into a larger category. That's what I'm saying, with a religious category. Right? This is the fundamental problem that we're talking about.
Got it.